Hello, hello. You know, we love seeing all of you. We do miss you. We have plans to see you soon in the fall, though. We're going to let go one more minute and let some people enter, and then we want to get started right on time. But I'm going to scroll through and see all of everybody. We were just telling Susan and Sally, our presenters, that you guys are the autism experts of California, that we're privately and personally invited to attend. Dina, I always love your background of the farmland of the valley.
Thank you.
Good. Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started because we have some introductions, but you all know that you're here to see all about and learn all about the Affirm module that just got developed, and our presenters will introduce in just a second. But first, let's do our antecedent-based intervention and get all settled for how we're going to participate today. So please rename your Zoom with your first and last name, because you remember we have to see you so we can give you your CEUs if you've signed up. Please keep your cameras on if possible. We know sometimes your internet gets weird if it's not, but please try and keep your cameras on so we can see that you're there and you're engaged and you're present and that you're here to listen deeply and have lots of fun. You'll see in the chat that there's a link to the participant materials. So be sure and get those up if you need them. And Patty's going to tell you all about the CEUs you signed up.
Yeah, we're thrilled to be able to offer some continuing education units for this particular webinar. You should have signed up when you registered. There was a question asking you if you were requesting CEUs, and if so, which type. The requirements as laid out by the issuers of the CEUs are that you have to attend the entire session. And so if you lose connectivity or have any problems with staying on the entire time, we're not going to be able to document the full number of minutes. So make sure you reach out if there's any issues where you're needing to switch, to your phone or something like that. But otherwise, it's the actual minutes of attendance and participation from the Zoom log that we rely on. You're going to, if you sign up for the CEUs, you're also required to complete the satisfaction survey that will go out at the end of the session. And we need to get that back to you within 2 days. So make sure that you're right on top of that. We ask for that from everyone because we do use the information that you provide to us to be able to plan for and improve future webinars. So be sure to do that satisfaction survey, even if you're not signed up for CEUs. If you do those 2 things, stay on the entire time and complete the satisfaction survey, then you will be eligible for the CEUs, and you should receive them within usually 30 days. Gives us a little bit of time to check our records and get those documents and everything out to you, but they will come to you within 30 days. Be sure to hold on to your certificates once you receive them, because we don't have the ability to issue duplicates. Sometimes they go in your junk or spam, so check there as well. But if you haven't received it in 30 days and are worried, go ahead and just send us an email and we'll make sure to work with you to make sure you have that documentation.
Okie doke. So we have a couple of more events this year free to you, the Captain Cadre. So remember the PLN that we've got going about high quality training and coaching. And so the last session is April 4th from 2:30 to 4. And don't worry, even if you didn't go to the first 2, you may certainly show up to this last session. You don't want to miss it. And then we just added this one. We're so excited. We're going to offer visual supports for adult learners with ASD and intellectual disability and developmental disability. And that'll be June 8th, 10:30 to 12, and that will be virtual, and you'll be getting a save the date for that as well. Do you guys like this slide? I'm live in person. I'm just going to keep my fingers crossed that we're really going to have our in-person summit November 2nd and 3rd in Riverside. I wanted to give you a heads up. You'll get an email coming that we're going to be charging this year because we want your budgets where you get your money for the next year to be in place. And so it'll be $150 to register, and then it will be $50 for boot camp or $50 for a workshop. But the main amount would be the $150 for you to attend the summit. But you're going to want to come to one of the workshops because they're going to be amazing. We do have 3 hotels down there, and we'll send all this out to you. But those rooms are around $179, just so you can start thinking about. I know a lot of you always want that information, so you could send it to your director and get it all approved, and we'll have the agenda go out to you. And if there's something else you need, just send an email to the captain website. And then we already have secured our in-person site for the Northern California Summit, where everybody will come on October 10th and 11th. And that's the only date we could get. So pay attention, it's not November in 2023, but it'll be at the Sheraton Grand Hotel. We're gonna have the whole hotel to ourselves. And we're going to have a big reception in that downstairs, and it's just going to be super fun to get back together again. So we're excited. Save the date.
All right, so we are just so thrilled to have this ongoing partnership and relationship with the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Center. The National Professional Development Center on Autism is housed there, as well as the Affirm modules. And we partnered with them through our SELPA Content Lead grant to actually develop the very module that you're going to be learning about today, as well as these others. So all of the updated modules on the Affirm website, Captain partnered with the folks at Affirm to be able to develop and bring to you, as well as everyone else. So if you haven't already, make sure you check those new modules out on music mediated intervention, behavior momentum, Ayres sensory integration, which you're going to learn more about today, and augmentative and alternative communication. And without further ado, I'd like to go ahead then and introduce to you our presenters, Sally, Wallace, Noel, and oops, you went too fast there, Ann. That's all right. And Susan, I'm going to try to say it right, Sendre. Did I do it? Okay, good. Thumbs up. Sally is a speech and language therapist and a research scientist at the Frank Porter Graham Child Development Institute at UNC Chapel Hill. And we have their bios there for you to read more in depth, but I think the important thing that you know is that she has extensive background and knowledge about assessment and treatment of social pragmatic communication challenges for children with autism. And she was the co-developer of the Affirm module on Ayres sensory integration. Next slide. And Susan is an occupational therapist, also from the UNC Frank Porter Graham Institute at UNC Chapel Hill, and extensive experience working with students with autism from preschool all the way through middle school. And is also the co-developer of the Affirm module. So we're thrilled to have them here today to share with you this information about Ayres sensory integration. We know you guys will have lots of questions, which we want to ask you to go ahead and put in the chat. And Ann and I will be sort of filtering through those questions and making sure that they get answered. But most everything that you need to know, you'll learn today, hear about today, and you can reference on the Affirm module. So just know that if you don't get a question answered, then the information's probably there for you. But we'll be making sure we keep track and forwarding those questions on to our presenters. And with that, Sally and Susan, it's all yours.
Great. I'm Sally. Thank you for the warm introduction. It's so nice that you have this captain group and are able to collaborate together. And we are thrilled to have had your support in developing this and the other 4 modules. I think there's one more about to be released. And It was a pleasure to do this review and pull together this information for you. And so we're going to go straight through the module content, but as Patty mentioned, please put your questions in the chat and we will try to address them if there are large themes periodically throughout, and if not, toward the end. So we are going to go through the modules, and if you have taken any of the Affirm modules, you'll know we have a basic section, and then we go through planning, using, and monitoring. And then we'll go through resources, some of which I think you already have access to, and I saw that the link to the resources was put in the chat as well. So let's go through the basics first. What is Ayres sensory integration? A little note about terminology. So Ayres sensory integration has also been referred in the literature in multiple ways, and especially in practice in lots of different ways, I think. But sensory integration therapy as originated by Aging Ayres, classical sensory integration, Ayres sensory integration therapy. We are going to use ASI for Ayres sensory integration throughout this talk and throughout the module if you take it online, to refer to these models of sensory integration that were supported by the systematic review that we conducted. And at this time, the evidence base from those articles only supports Ayres sensory integration, not other forms of sensory integration or sensory treatments. And Ayres sensory integration does require specialized training with a certified provider to implement with fidelity. And this training is most commonly completed by occupational therapists, although we're told that in some cases they allow other licensed therapists to attend, but it's primarily an OT practice. And this module is not intended to replace that training or the certification process, but we would like to introduce basic knowledge of ASI as an evidence-based practice and talk about how it could be implemented in school if you are collaborating with someone trained. So Jean Ayres developed sensory integration as a theory and a practice. She was at USC, University of Southern California at the time. ASI targets a learner's ability to process and internally regulate, integrate sensory information with their body and with the environment. And it tailors activities that utilize just right challenges to a learner's existing patterns of sensory processing and motor planning, and encourage movement and organization of self in time and space. It does incorporate specialized equipment and materials in purposeful and playful activities. And usually this equipment and materials is within a clinic setting. And so we want to make that clear. And also define that a just right challenge is like a therapeutic sensory motor task that meets the learner at their present skill level and pushes them exactly enough to achieve or become incrementally closer to achieving through therapy the next skill level, while keeping the interaction fun and engaging. The main principles of Ayres sensory integration are active engagement of the student, naturalistic intervention approaches for arousal, attention, motor planning, including arrangement of the intervention environment, individualized treatment that's one-on-one with a trained certified therapist, usually clinic-based services, and quite a bit of time intensity. If you looked at the articles that were in our review, they were usually 2 to 3 times a week for at least 45-minute sessions with a trained therapist. So at a higher intensity than a lot of other interventions. Treatment's usually delivered by an occupational therapist. Again, not just any occupational therapist, but one who's trained in the approach. And treatment of students with autism who have clinically significant sensory processing dysfunction. So not all children with autism, but those who have significant sensory processing dysfunction and might benefit from ASI based on a professional assessment. So again, implemented by therapists with the specialized training and not all OTs can implement ASI, just those who are trained. Reiterating takes place in a specially designed clinical setting that offers this safe and sensory-rich experience. There are some rare instances where ASI can be used in a school setting when a school OT has ASI training and specific space and equipment is available in the school. I think that is very rare, and it's also possible that in consultation with a trained OT, ASI recommendations could be integrated into the classroom as kind of part of the generalization process that complements the child's ASI therapy in a clinic setting. We did want to mention that there are only 3 articles that formed the evidence base for the module as it qualified in our systematic review, and all of those took place in a clinical setting. We do not have a substantial evidence base for using ASI within a school. This table is figure is in the module brief packet, which I think you have in your materials, but it goes over the basics of sensory information and the various modalities. In autism, multiple modalities can be impacted, and they can have different responses to each of those. And for more extensive examples beyond these of ASI challenges by sensory modality, there is this resource on the Sensory Integration Global Network that has some more examples if you want to share those with parents or illustrate things for team discussion. So take a moment here and make sure you're listening. Ask you a question about how many learners with autism do you think have difficulty processing and modulating sensory stimuli? So I'll give you a second to think about it, and if it helps hold you accountable, you can put it in the chat or write it down. And the answer is many of them. About 56 to 70% of learners with autism are estimated to have sensory processing challenges. About 5 to 16% of the total school-age learner population are reported to have these difficulties with processing and integrating sensation. So it's not exclusive to autism, but it does impact more learners with autism than the total school-age learner population. So what is not Ayres sensory integration? And we don't usually have this slide. I was sharing with Patty, and we don't usually have a slide on what a practice is not, but it feels very important given the amount of misinformation and confusion about ASI that we discuss what is not included and what we do not yet have evidence for based on our review. And so it is also really hard to know what is or is not ASI. And the following intervention approaches might be confused with ASI, but they right now have insufficient evidence and should not be considered ASI. And those are use of specific equipment for passive stimulation, like brushing protocols, swings, weighted vests, weighted blankets, squeeze machines, sensory diets, just use of a sensory gym or sensory space in general, touch therapy, sensory motor intervention, and auditory integration therapy. So all students need to successfully process and modulate sensory input, well, all of us, even as adults, not just children even, to participate fully in daily activities, including those at school. And ASI therapy may help children deal with sensory challenges when they're present that may lead to improvement in other goals. So the research literature that we've reviewed so far suggests that such improvements could be seen in motor skills, adaptive skills, specifically independence with self-care. One of the articles found that children needed less help from their parents or teachers with feeding, hand washing, and toileting. Cognition skills like executive functioning, including cognitive flexibility, planning, and working memory. Communication skills, social skills, academic and pre-academic skills, and also a reduction in interfering behaviors, like repetitive behaviors and repetitive motor movements. And those are talking about more intrusive examples of those things, not just what one might need to regulate. Like many of us might be tapping our feet right now or drumming our fingers, talking about things that are more interfering than that. So do all learners with autism need ASI? And no, everyone has some preferences and differences in their processing of sensations. It's only when sensory processing really interferes with the learner's functioning and daily activities, what OTs usually call activities of daily living or ADLs, or achievement of their goals, is intervention needed. And specifically with ASI, you would want a specific ASI evaluation, which we'll talk about, to make sure that ASI is even the sensory intervention that you would need. So no, all learners with autism do not need ASI. Ways that ASI can help learners. Learners who struggle with sensory processing information might be limited in their ability to engage and attend to tasks, complete coordinated motor movements, perform their self-care tasks, plan and sequence new tasks, regulate their emotions, follow classroom expectations, and communicate and socialize within their relationships with others. So all of those things can be quite impairing to the student. And so to take their perspective for a minute, we created some scenarios where it might cause you to feel like a learner with autism would when they were struggling with their sensory input. And one is trying to complete an important test while someone flicks the lights on and off, trying to introduce yourself to a new work colleague while fighting nausea from like something really smelly right behind you or right next to you, trying to remember everything on your grocery list with an emergency siren blaring, or spinning around in circles for 2 minutes and then attempting to dress yourself for the day. Those are just some examples of like taking their perspective and thinking about how interfering this information can be. Because these scenarios might make you feel really dysregulated and out of control, have some fight or flight responses, even, yell at someone, throw up, and learners with autism may experience these feelings during daily activities. So ASI can help learners regulate their bodies and process their sensory information so that they can complete daily activities without these interfering feelings. And learners may benefit from ASI to support their fine and gross motor skills, adaptive skills, communication and socialization skills, as well as their emotion regulation. Susan, I'll have you read this one since everyone's been hearing my voice. I'm gonna try and change up here.
Okay, so here's a practice scenario from the perspective of the teacher. So Marcus came to my preschool class with a new diagnosis of autism. His parents were completely overwhelmed because Marcus wasn't sleeping at night. The slightest noise in their house woke him up. His auditory sensitivity was also a problem at school. The air conditioning turning on made him run into a corner and cover his ears. He played alone and avoided most activities and other kids. If there was an unexpected noise, he would have a complete meltdown and bite himself on the arms. I knew that sensory integration may help Marcus and suggested his parents talk to his pediatrician. The pediatrician referred him for an evaluation by a certified OT to address the issues at home. Marcus started receiving ASI from a trained OT. The OT was able to help his parents and us at school. The OT met with us and guided us on how to use some of the strategies in the classroom to help Marcus stop hurting himself and participate at school.
And I'll do this one. Ironically, I'll be the OT when you're actually the OT. As an OT in a middle school, I wasn't sure that I needed sensory integration training. Though ASI therapy provided a specialized clinic Though ASI therapy is provided in a specialized clinic setting, I was getting lots of kids with autism on my caseload with issues in emotion regulation, motor planning, and interfering behaviors. Unfortunately, their emotional and behavioral outbursts around sensory issues were leading to disciplinary referrals and expulsions. I decided to get ASI training to better support these middle schoolers. I used an ASI approach to modify the school environment for individual students' sensory needs. The echo in the gym seemed to be especially hard for some kids, so we started providing a quiet space in one of the coaches' offices where kids could take a break. I can also better educate my colleagues to reduce disciplinary referrals and promote the success of our students. Susan, will you be the parent?
Yes. And funny because you're the parent and I'm not. Do a little role reversal today. Carmen was 6 when she was diagnosed with autism. The doctor said it was sensory processing disorder before that because many of her symptoms were around sensory issues. Carmen hated the smell and feel of most foods. She gagged and vomited at mealtimes starting when she was a baby, and we introduced solid foods. Daycare and school meals were challenging, and Carmen had to eat her food from home in a separate room from the other kids. We couldn't go anywhere that there would be food smells for fear that she would throw up or have a meltdown suddenly. It really restricted our social life and hers. Once we started seeing an OT for Ayres sensory integration therapy, Carmen's behavior around food started to improve. We've worked on gradually increasing her tolerance for the smell and feel of food. She doesn't throw up anymore and can eat in a small lunch bunch group at school. It has made a big difference for her.
Those are just to illustrate some ways that this could be used in practice. So now we'll go through some of the evidence for ASI. So our National Clearinghouse on Autism Evidence in Practice, or NCAPE, reviewed the literature from 1990 to 2017, and our report came out in 2020. ASI focused intervention meets criteria with 3, actually they're group design studies. I should edit that. And the practice has been effective for preschoolers, elementary school learners, and middle school learners with autism. The studies included detail how this practice can be used to effectively address the following outcomes: academic, pre-academic, adaptive self-help, challenging and interfering behavior, cognitive, communication, motor, and social. And again, all of these studies took place in a clinic setting or a research clinic setting, and none were in schools. I'm going to turn it over to Susan now for the planning part.
Okay. Do we have a question in the chat? Should we answer that before we move on?
Yeah, I think the timing to answer that is good. Do you want me to read it?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, so what is the difference between Ayres sensory integration generalization, like you just described, in the school setting versus antecedent-based interventions, specifically the ABI for changing or altering the sensory environment?
Yeah, I can answer this one, Sally, if that's a. So sensory integration or sensory interventions in particular can be so tricky because it's both sometimes the target of the intervention and the outcome. So both the process and the outcome, I should say. And sometimes it's the process to get to another outcome. And so it gets a little bit theoretical. So ASI is based in theory and practice. So it's not just what you're doing, but the whole theory that comes with it, that you are altering the way that someone can integrate sensory input in their environment in themselves. ABI is just a different kind of approach and can be used for targeting different outcomes. So if you're familiar with that, it might be like, oh, we're effectively doing the same thing in a small way. But when you are planning it and when you're monitoring it and assessing it, you're coming at it from 2 different perspectives. So it can look the same, but it is different. And I don't know if that fully answers the question, but ABI is just a little bit smaller in scale, and it's it doesn't need a trained therapist to be able to totally assess the full sensory scope. Does that make sense? Sally, anything you wanted to add? Okay. Yes, this is confusing. So do let us know what your questions are. We can keep talking about them. All right. So talking about planning for ASI. So if you're familiar with our firm modules, we have this setup of plan, use, and monitor. So we're going to go through this first process of planning and determining whether it's appropriate to use ASI as an intervention. Can you hit next, Sally? Thanks. Okay, so as we stated, we're using ASI does require training from certified providers. So USC, which is where Ayres develops sensory integration theory and practice, offers an in-person and online continuing ed certificate program. And presently, they're the only certification program recommended by AOTA. And it's mostly occupational therapists, but some clinicians may take the course if they provide some additional documentation and credentials. And in addition, there's some researchers at Thomas Jefferson University who have manualized ASI using rigorous methods, and they have a clinician's guide for implementing ASI and promoting participation for children. So again, that's just reminding us all that to implement ASI with fidelity, you do need this certification. Okay, so next is to determine this learner sensory needs. So if you have concerns about a learner sensory needs, you'll need to conduct an assessment that can help you determine their current processing level as well as specific areas of need that learners might have. And sensory experiences can be so individualized and specific. So this is a really important part of determining what can actually be helpful and what the true cause of something is. So this information may be used as part of a referral to a trained OT or part of an ASI assessment conducted by a trained OT. So the questions that you might ask yourself are, is the learner distracted by sensory stimuli in a way that intrudes with their academic goals? Is the showing challenging behaviors in response to sensory stimuli? Does the learner seek certain sensory input in a way that interferes with their academic or social goals? Or does the learner avoid certain age-appropriate activities due to suspected sensory issues? Is the learner distracted by sensory stimuli in a way that intrudes with social goals? So again, this is sort of determining that threshold of where this is really impacting their day. So like we said, not every learner with autism has sensory issues that meet the threshold of needing intervention. So, there's a difference between, wow, that's a really loud noise, and I'm going to step back and step away, and I'm uncomfortable for a few minutes, but I'm able to self-regulate after, versus that's a loud noise, and now the rest of my day is ruined because it's dysregulated me so much. So there's, there can be extremes in some of these behaviors. And so determining at, what threshold the learner's needs are is important. So this can be done through collecting observational data. So thinking about what time and activity and what the sensory input might be around that, and then what the behaviors are that's observed. So I won't read through this whole thing, but I think the bus is an important one when we're thinking about school, because it might be out of sight, out of mind for some people, but it can be really impacting for our students with autism who show up to school after riding on a bus. And thinking about some of the sensory experiences that they've gone through. The bus maybe smells bad, or it vibrated on the way to school, and then it honks a lot. Like they honk for every kid that gets on, and then as they drive away, they honk again. And so sort of those things that might be happening and observing how the student responds. So maybe the student covers their ears or hums to themselves while coming off the bus in anticipation of that extra honk that occurs as the bus driver drives away. Or maybe in gym, you notice that they're doing seated scooter races, and the student is smiling and squealing in delight with the other kids while racing on the scooters because they really enjoy that sensation. So that might be an example of how you can structure observational assessment to go through and think about how sensory experiences are impacting a child throughout the day. And formal ASI assessment is from a certified provider, usually an OT, that has several components that were developed by Ayres. And so this is what the process might look like may involve for a learner. So observation of the learner in natural settings, so some of the observations that we just talked about, but maybe across settings, parent and teacher interviews, standardized testing, and then structured observations of the learner in a clinical setting with various sensory stimuli. So the sensory integration and practice tests is the battery of 17 standardized tests that was contributed to the development of ASI theory and has been used to determine aspects of sensory processing and integration that are challenging for learners between 4 and 8. So right now, this is considered the gold standard for assessing sensory integration and praxis issues using norm reference scores. And during the last 30 years, other standardized tests and parent surveys have been developed to identify sensory processing disorders. So you may be familiar with the sensory profile or the sensory processing measure. Those are coming from different sort of backgrounds on sensory issues, and they're not perfectly aligned with ASI all the time. So there are other, sensory assessments, but it doesn't mean that they're ASI assessments.
Sally, there was a question that came up in the chat that seems appropriate to answer right now. It's the assessments that are given are usually administered by an OT, but can anyone else administer the assessments like a school psychologist?
Right now, to administer the SIPT, you need to go through the SIPT, sensory integration practice test. You need to go through the certification training. And it is pretty specific. So not just anyone can do that. So a school psychologist might be able to provide support to a certified ASI therapist by, answering some of the questions about interviews or maybe helping with some observations. But right now, it would still come from a trained OT. Okay, so other support staff like classroom teachers who are ineligible to receive that formalized training may support the ASI assessment process by contributing valuable information, like we just talked about. So referring or recommending an ASI assessment, and you can see when to refer to a learner for an OT assessment related to ASI on the previous page. Knowledge of the learner's family's concerns about sensory issues can be helpful to relay to the team. Observing and reporting on the student's sensory responses across the day. So that observational data example that we talked about, or knowledge of classroom routines where ASI might be beneficial to try, or implementing part of the comprehensive treatment plan might be embedded throughout the day. So knowledge of those routines. And then understanding the students' preferences and what motivates them during the day. As we stated before, it uses natural reinforcers and a naturalistic approach to therapy. So having knowledge of the student is really important to share with the team when implementing this. And then student goal development and feasibility of implementing these goals in the classroom context. So maybe the students' concerns are something that isn't coming up throughout the day. And you can be able to say, yeah, we aren't having that problem in this classroom, or that doesn't happen here. So, or maybe that goal is a great goal, but not relevant to my specific context. So being able to communicate to the team whether or not you think ASI might be relevant to the learner or student in your setting. And develop an ASI session plan. So like we said, what information we have now are individualized treatment programs that are always completed one-on-one with the learner and a trained ASI therapist. So that is the limitation of the positive research right now. And so that means the sessions occur at a set clinical meeting place and like on a schedule. So the sessions may be more often, may occur more frequently or more often, as Sally mentioned, than typical therapy sessions. And often it means meeting at least 2 times per week. So the key components of the treatment session must be pre-planned to include the following. So Sally mentioned the principles earlier, and so we'll keep bringing those up a couple times as we talk about it. So the sensory opportunities, promoting optimal adaptive behavior, as well as physical and emotional safety for the learner. So those sensory opportunities may be tactile, so different textured items to touch and explore, proprioceptive, pushing or pulling toys, heavy lifting activities, obstacle courses that include heavy equipment, or vestibular. So balance beams, swings, trampolines, or other playground equipment that provides intense movement. And so having a really robust assessment is important for this point to determine what these specific opportunities, sensory opportunities are that will benefit the child in the session. So the sensory motor activities and experiences designed to meet the learner at their current adaptive level and also challenge them to move one step further. So we're not trying to push them to the point of frustration, but push them with growth within that just right, safe, sort of comfortable space that is still just a step beyond their current level. And then activities that are motivating for the learner to attempt themselves with support from the therapist, activities that will challenge the learner to successfully make and carry out a plan, and activities that will address postural control and balance using specialized equipment. And the following additional principles are essential for delivering ASI, and that's ensuring physical safety, collaborating in the activity of choice, and supporting the child's intrinsic motivation to play. Apologies, my dog is having a sensory regulation experience in the background right now. So right on cue. If you can hear that, I apologize. So during ASI, it's also incredibly helpful to use those additional foundational evidence-based practices that we know about. So modeling, for example, in an ASI therapy session, the therapist may model a new sensory experience or sensation before the learner tries it themselves. Or modeling may be helpful for a sensory experience that has been tolerated in one setting. So for example, therapy, but not yet in the classroom. So that can be done live by a teacher or another student. Social narratives. So you might plan to use a social narrative to prepare that learner for a situation with new sensory stimuli. Task analysis is a key part of occupational therapy, and having such a connection to occupational therapy, this is critical in ASI. So task analysis, being able to help establish and execute a multi-step activity. Or video modeling. So some learners may like to watch themselves or other students modeling an activity first or while they're doing it. And then visual support. So some learners might need visual supports or schedules to guide them through the session or prepare them for the sensory experiences that are coming up in their day. And reinforcement. So I mentioned this a little bit already, but ASI uses natural reinforcers in sessions to promote the learner's intrinsic motivation to play. So that means the activities are designed to be naturally interesting and motivating to the learner, and completion of those activities is rewarded naturally rather than with tangible rewards. So for example, a learner who likes Minecraft might be naturally motivated and rewarded to complete a Minecraft themed obstacle course with similar components as the game. And so that might, as I mentioned before, that might be an important part for you to share information with the team when you're addressing ASI, especially as teachers, we know, tend to spend more time in the day with students than an occupational therapist might. So sharing that information can be really helpful when implementing as a team. And then discussing the plan with the team members. So all of the members of this learner school team, including family members, will need to understand how they're processing challenges and how understand the learner sensory processing challenges and how to implement the strategies if appropriate. So the trained OT might provide some basic training on types of sensory modalities, which we've sort of touched on today, but haven't really gone into, and how these sensory processing issues may impact the learner. And then making sure the team members understand that many interfering behaviors are responses to sensory stimuli and are not appropriate for disciplinary measures. So having a trained OT who has done a robust sort of assessment of the learner sensory needs to be able to establish, this is a sensory response versus this is a response to a different issue, and disciplining a sensory response is just not an effective, it's not going to be an effective outcome. And discussing the ASI strategies with the team the team will use to support the learner in the school setting if appropriate. And then plan for unexpected sensory events and how to keep the learner and other students safe in these instances. So those might be sort of the discussions that are taking place. And more considerations about this team planning. If the learner's peers are affected by the learner's sensory needs or behaviors, or if peers are asking questions about sensory strategies in the classroom, so maybe they use a support like a wiggle seat or ask questions, things like that. Providing some age-appropriate education and awareness training for them as well might be important to discuss as the team. And then whenever possible, including the learner as a leader of their own support team, helping them determine the information they want or don't want shared about their sensory experiences with others, and providing choices about supports, activities, and behavior plans. Because as we mentioned, we want this to be naturally motivating. And so having the learner have agency in this process is one of the principles that's very important. And when this is not possible, making sure the family members are leading contributors on the team. So this should not be new if you've done an affirm module before, but part of the plans process is having your materials ready before a session. And so that might be having a planning checklist, which you can find in the affirm module. And we'll just kind of briefly touch on that today, but not go too far into it. So, and here's a little bit of a planning activity that we'll go through quickly. So Ravi is a student in Ms. Mitchell's second grade classroom. He has difficulty focusing during class instruction and during independent work. He frequently runs from his desk near the window and buries himself in the beanbag chair in the reading corner of the classroom. He also hums, sometimes loudly, in response to certain sounds that he hears. Ms. Mitchell is confident that Ravi is able to comprehend the lessons, but his distractibility and interfering behaviors are impacting his academic progress. So here might be a time where we use the checklist to determine his needs. And so if you want to read through that quickly and maybe think of your responses or write them down, if you want to put them in the chat, feel free to. If there are any responses that Ravi might be having difficulty with. So is he distracted by sensory stimuli in a way that intrudes with his academic goals? Is he showing behaviors in response to the sensory stimuli? Does he seek certain sensory input in a way that interferes with his academic or social goals? Does he avoid certain age-appropriate activities due to suspected sensory issues? And is he distracted by sensory stimuli in a way that intrudes with social goals? So the stars are where you should have answered yes for Ravi in this situation. So he is distracted by that sensory stimuli in a way that is interfering with his academic goals. And he's showing challenging behaviors in response to sensory stimuli, and he's avoiding certain age-appropriate activities due to these suspected issues. So, oh yeah, great. So from Miss Mitchell's observational data, she might have noticed that in morning work, there was an intercom beep, and then Ravi ran from his desk to the beanbag chair, head down in the bag and humming. So I won't read through all of these, but it's just sort of an example of how Ms. Mitchell might have gone through this observation. So selecting a goal for Robbie, from the observational data provided by Ms. Mitchell and from the ASI assessment, the OT learned that loud, sudden, and unexpected noises are particularly interfering for him. So he is, however, able to focus and complete work tasks in quiet environments. So given this information, let's try to select what might be an annual goal for Robbie. And the options would be: at school, Robbie will complete assignments daily. With the support of noise canceling headphones during independent work time in the classroom, Robbie will engage in independent work for 15 minutes in 4 out of 5 opportunities in a week. Robbie will stay in his seat during class, or during recess, Robbie will interact with his peers daily. So which one might be the most helpful? I think from the observational data provided, the best goal would be: with the support of noise canceling headphones during independent work time in the classroom, Robbie will engage in independent work for 15 minutes in 4 out of 5 opportunities in a week.
Sally, there were a couple of good questions, and Susan, there were a couple of good questions that came up in the chat.
Okay.
The first one, which I think sort of leads to several of the others. If there are sensory concerns impacting a student's learning, and the team does not have access to an ASI certified provider or the appropriate context and setting with all the sensory equipment, is it appropriate to select and implement other evidence-based practices? And if so, do you have any indication of which ones might the school team be able to use for these sensory related issues?
Yeah, so I don't know if I mentioned this yet already, but ASI is not the only approach to sensory outcomes. So in our systematic review, we have some domain outcomes in different domains, and sensory issues fall under the motor category of our systematic review. And we're testing my knowledge right on the spot. I think exercise is considered an evidence-based practice to benefit sensory motor outcomes. Sorry, apologies. Prompting and reinforcement, as we talked about, that's always a pretty safe place to start. And then
ABI.
Oh, ABI, yes. So taking an ABI approach, as we said before, that's a little bit more targeted and not as comprehensive as ASI, but still an approach that would be useful in a school setting, definitely. So falling back on the other evidence-based practices that we do have, and if you're ever wondering, you can go onto our website and you can search by domain what evidence-based practices there are, and you can see the articles and sort of look into it more in depth.
Right. We do have a search tool where you're able to search by domain and specifically look at practices and articles for each outcome that you may want to target. And certainly not having the resources to implement ASI would be a very valid reason to look for other options. Were there other questions, or did others sort of branch off of that one, Patty?
Yeah, I think most of them were sort of an offshoot of that, kind of trying to figure out if a kiddo has these issues, what direction the IEP team should take, or if a parent specifically requests ASI to address sensory concerns, but the team doesn't necessarily have access to an ASI trained therapist or motor room. What are some other options that they might be able to put forward to address the area of need?
Definitely using that tool would be an option. You could even explore that with the parent at times too, and show them some options. But certainly if you have an OT on your team, consulting with them about the strategies that they suggest for that individual student would be important as well. Even if they aren't ASI trained, they would be the ones to provide valuable information and assessment.
Thank you.
Okay, so I will go into using ASI. So once you've done all of those planning steps, how do you actually use or implement ASI? So the first step in using is to address those session goals that you outlined. And as we talked about, optimally, these would be with a trained ASI therapist in a specialized clinic environment, one-on-one with a therapist and individualized to the learner, using those sensory experiences, a response to a just right challenge, an enriched physical environment within the context of naturally motivating play, and using the concept of a therapeutic alliance. So that's building that trusting relationship between the therapist and learner, where the child is comfortable stepping up to their just right challenge, if you will, and extending themselves so that they can make progress. And here is a fidelity scale where you can determine if ASI is being implemented correctly or with fidelity. And we've talked about several of these things, but a couple that we haven't talked about was presenting sensory opportunities from at least 2 different modalities would be part of a session for ASI. The therapist will help the child maintain an optimal level of alertness for engagement. So not getting too hypersensitive or overstimulated, or not being under aroused either. So using those materials in that clinic setting and the child's natural motivation for play to stay within kind of an optimal engagement band for learning. And the therapist supported and challenged at least one of postural control, ocular control, and bilateral coordination. The therapist challenged planning and organization of behavior or series of behaviors. So sequencing a behavior, doing some of that task analysis stuff that we were talking about. The therapist collaborates with the learner in choosing activities and materials. We talked about just right challenges. The therapist is also supposed to, as part of the just right challenge, make sure that activities are able to be successful, and certainly that they end on a successful note. And this also includes that therapeutic alliance, that trusting relationship with the learner. So using other EBPs to support ASI, we've talked about this a little, but in practice, we want you to remember that ASI sessions use naturalistic intervention strategies, like supporting the learner's intrinsic motivation to play and collaborating with the learner in choosing activities and materials, rather than a lot of formal prompting and reinforcement. So those are just implemented in a more naturalistic context. So you might want to do some reflecting before and after each session to ensure that ASI activities are naturally engaging and reinforcing to the learner. And we also have a module like naturalistic interventions are an evidence-based practice in themselves. So we definitely encourage you to look at resources or view the whole module for naturalistic interventions, because all of those strategies are incorporated into ASI in some way. Other EBPs you might want to use are visual supports, like visual cues or schedules that can guide the learner through an ASI session or prepare them for sensory experiences that will occur within their day. We talked about how an ASI therapist might use modeling, and then in generalization, you might have a teacher or another student model. And here is kind of a case study for how you might use this practice. So Mia has difficulty tolerating various tactile sensations, including certain clothing items and food textures. She participates in twice weekly ASI treatment sessions to learn to tolerate a wider variety of textures. Mia's therapist works to provide naturally reinforcing activities for Mia during the sessions. She also uses the additional EBP of modeling to make expectations clear for Mia. All right, so take a break for a question. Which of the following is not an essential element of ASI sessions? We just went through them and hopefully have been repeating many of them throughout the steps, which I know can sound repetitive, but that's in a lot of ways how we learn is within context, hearing different ways that we use that same concept throughout. So which of the following is not an essential element of ASI sessions? A sensory experience, a small group setting, a just right challenge, or an enriched physical environment? And it's a small group setting. ASI sessions include a sensory experience, a response to a sensory just right challenge, and an enriched physical environment. But ASI sessions take place one-on-one with a learner and a trained ASI therapist. So now we'll talk about promoting generalization. So since ASI therapy takes place in a really controlled environment, generalizing the learner's positive sensory experiences from that treatment room to home, school, and community settings is a process. And that's a process that school is likely to be involved in. So even if you aren't part of implementing the actual ASI treatment, you might be part of this generalization process. So to promote it, consider communicating regularly with the learner's team, including their trained ASI therapists, their family, practitioners, and school personnel, about consistently supporting the learner's sensory goals across settings. Collaborate with the team to adapt home, school, and community environments to the learner's needs when possible. Again, we want to meet them halfway, not make the learner do all of the work. And just think about ways when it's an opportunity to be accommodating and accepting of the learner and when it's time to implement other strategies. Work with the learner's team to establish consistent responses to the learner's challenging behaviors when sensory input becomes overwhelming. And whenever possible, allow the learner to be part of their own sensory goals and include them in plans to generalize their skills and respond to unexpected sensory events. The learner or the learner's family are likely the ones that know them best. Classroom teachers would probably come right after that. So we want to make sure that we're speaking to the learner and to the family and those people closest to promote this generalization. So with the trained ASI therapist guidance, the team will need to carefully review the learner's daily activities and social interactions to determine if ASI strategies would be appropriate during the school day. And if so, plan opportunities for the learner to use strategies from the ASI therapist. It's important not to overly challenge the learner, but to help them generalize skills that they've gained in treatment to the school setting. So likely it would be some of the exact same things that they have been really successful with in treatment, just changing the environment. And teachers and other school staff would provide valuable knowledge of the learner's daily routines and activities during this process. We've provided some resources for how to plan opportunities for ASI strategy use. And this is one to start with the various settings in which the learner struggles and plan for ASI strategies and how to improve the learner's response. The first one is an example of kind of the bus horn beep and some options for how you might use ASI strategies like providing noise canceling headphones, or even ask the bus driver just not to honk the horn. Is that completely necessary at that time? If the learner's struggling with food smells and it's causing gagging and retching, you might allow the student to eat with a small group or to walk around the lunchroom to outdoor seating areas. I feel like right now with COVID, there are lots of options for this, probably particularly in California where your weather is nicer. And to think about just different ways to accommodate that. A child that's seeking movement during class time, You might want to add movement breaks that could benefit a lot of the students, or move math class to happen directly after recess or gym, or provide some quiet fidgeting options. We have several examples here, and I won't go through all of them, but just a good way to think about it would be to combine the observational data and think about the different settings where the learner struggles, and then work as a team to talk about the different ASI strategies that could work for that particular learner. Here's another case study. This is Damien. Damien has been working with an ASI therapist to address his sensory needs related to seeking movement. He's been making progress in his one-on-one sessions, and his team is ready to support generalizing the skills he's learned. To prepare for using ASI strategies at school, his teacher and school-based OT work with his therapist to develop the generalization plan here. So, as we've discussed, they're combining their observational data of going from start to finish within the school day. It might take a few days of observation if the student changes classes and has different specials or therapies throughout the week. You want to be pretty comprehensive, but thinking about accommodations for Damien's arrival time, for during independent work, for math, and at lunch. And thinking about flexible seating options, movement breaks, fidget toys, and just other options throughout the day for making, for accommodating Damien's sensory needs. The generalization plan template is also in our brief packet, and that's available to you. Here's another question break. The following people should be involved in planning for generalization of ASI strategies. And your choices are the therapist, the learner's family, the learner, or all of the above. And that should be a pretty easy one given our discussion. All of the above. The ASI therapist should guide the process, but other team members, the learner's family, the teacher, the school-based personnel will all work together to plan for and carry out the process, because the ASI therapist is not going to know what's feasible within the home or the school setting. And that's where that collaboration is just really key. Here's another activity to think about how you would implement ASI. So, which evidence-based practices would be useful in supporting Abby's ASI session? Abby is a 5th grade student with autism. She sees a therapist twice weekly to address her sensory needs. Her ASI therapist is working with her to increase her tolerance of unexpected sensory stimuli. Abby reads at grade level, follows written instructions well, and uses a visual schedule at school. Help Abby's therapist consider which additional EBPs might be useful in supporting Abby's ASI sessions. And your choices are modeling, social narratives, visual supports, discrete trial training, although that is misspelled, and time delay. And though you could use many of these, social narratives and visual supports would be the best choices for supporting Abby's ASI sessions, because we know that she's already responding well to them, and her team is ready to implement those.
All right, so our last big section is how to monitor the use of ASI. Okay, thanks, Sally.
Right, so it doesn't want to advance after I go on mute. It's funny.
All right, so part of the monitoring process is collecting and analyzing the data. So You'll need to collect and analyze data on the learner's ASI therapy progress by goal. So you can use observational data to track this progress. And so important things to include on your data form would be the setting of the observation, the sensory experiences available in the setting by modality. So like the ones that we mentioned before, proprioceptive, tactile, etc. Learner's response or lack of responses to the sensory stimuli, the level of prompting needed for the learner to participate in that sensory setting, and then other EBPs or strategies that were used to support the learner. So obviously, you'll want to work as a team to decide on how to collect this data. And it's important to continuously collect and review the data with the learner's ASI team. And so here's just an example. I know we all have our own ways of how we want to organize and collect our data, but here is just an example of how you might monitor it. So the goal in this example is that the learner will eat lunch from home in the cafeteria without signs of discomfort or distress, and some of those examples of what distress and discomfort might be, in 4 out of 5 trials. So then this has it broken down by date, sensory stimuli, so what was made to eat that day, or the day that there was a field trip, mentioning that it was a picnic from lunch from home in a museum field. And then the behaviors observed. And then, so for example, when the learner was in a museum field, they ate lunch calmly in the quiet setting. And then the level of support needed on those days. So there's a little key below for suggestions of how you can note support levels. So for example, that Wednesday in the field that was quiet and the learner calmly ate their lunch, that was an independent day. And then any notes that you might have. So as we're monitoring the data, we also want to reflect on how usage has gone. So simple questions like, how do you think that went? Sometimes that's an obvious answer of, oh, that was terrible, or, this part went well, but something else could have gone better. And so breaking that down further into maybe what challenges did you encounter while implementing it? Were the activities naturally motivating for the learner, utilizing their natural drive to play? At what points did you see the strategies working? What could you have done differently? Did you feel comfortable implementing the ASI strategies? And did the learner respond positively to naturally occurring reinforcers? And then lastly, did the learner seem to enjoy the activities? So as you can see, they're coming off some of those principles that we discussed earlier, that they should be have positive responses, naturally motivating, enjoyable activities. But that's also just good guidance for practitioners to use if you're the ASI therapist, or if you're someone who's implementing a generalization activity under the guidance of the therapist. Then those are still, important questions to reflect on and ask yourself, so you're able to communicate that back to the team of like, this isn't working like we planned, or whatever might need to happen. So determining those next steps, examining that data will help the team members decide what about the effectiveness of using this practice and whether the learner with autism is making progress towards their ASI goals. If a learner is making progress based upon data collected, the team member should continue to use the selected strategies. And so what do you do if the team members determine the learner is not making progress? Consider some of the following. Team members received ASI, or is additional training needed? Is the target goal, behavior, or skill well defined? Is the target goal, behavior, or skill measurable and observable? That can be hard a lot with sensory experiences. It can be a very internal experience, and sometimes that's difficult for students to communicate. And so we're going based on people's best ability to verbalize how they're feeling, or their behavior showing how they're feeling. So this is a particularly challenging thing in the world of sensory treatment, to make sure that the target goal is measurable and observable. And then, has enough time been devoted to this practice? Has the frequency, intensity, or duration been appropriate? So like we said, this is a high intensity intervention based on the evidence that we currently have. And so for right now, that's the best approach, is to do it as they've done in research, which is at high intensity. The target behavior or skill being targeted appropriate during appropriate routines or activities. So are you targeting something at the wrong time of day? Is it not necessarily the appropriate time to be targeting that skill? And is ASI appropriate or a good fit for the target behavior? Like we said, ASI is not necessary for all students, and it may not be the best approach based on the learner's needs and whatever the target behavior is that the team is working on. So are the ASI strategies addressing the target behavior, or maybe it's different strategies? Maybe you find out it's really just the social narratives or the visual supports that are targeting the behavior, and that might be a good sign that those are the route to take and not necessarily a full comprehensive ASI approach. Or does the learner need additional support? So maybe the selected materials or activities aren't intrinsically motivating or are outside of that just right challenge. Maybe they're too easy or too hard. So reevaluating the need for additional supports. And so if all of those issues have been addressed and the learner with ASD continues not to show progress, that would be a time to consider selecting a different evidence-based practice to use with that learner. So a quick question: which of the following steps is not part of monitoring ASI? 1, occasionally collecting and reviewing observational data. 2, collecting data on the level of prompting and support provided to the learner. 3, using self-reflection when discussing ASI data. Or 4, making decisions about the effectiveness of ASI based on the data. So which of the following is not part of monitoring? And I'm seeing some ones in the chat, and that's correct. Occasionally monitoring, or occasionally collecting and reviewing data. Continuous data collection is an important part of monitoring ASI, and data should then be reviewed on an ongoing basis with the learner's ASI team. Do we want to cut this activity for sake of time, or so we can get to some questions maybe? And if you're wanting an example of this monitoring activity, I'll just sort of like recap it quickly. So it's about collecting data, drawing conclusions, and identifying next possible steps. So if you want to practice that, you can go to our Affirm module. And this example will be in there if you're wanting more practice. And so again, it's just using that support that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, probably a good call just to make sure we can address all of your questions. We do have several resources, as with all of our Affirm modules. We have a step-by-step practice guide, an implementation checklist, a tip sheet for professionals. There's a parent guide, and all of this is in the brief packet that you have access to as part of this training. These are our references, and these include the articles that were used to inform this practice, as well as several that we noted throughout, including that manualized version of ASI. That book is on here, but also feel free to contact us if you have questions about that, or want further information that could help your particular practice. We're happy to connect you as needed.
There was one question of many, but one of them was, who is a good candidate for this, or are there criteria for ability levels and responsiveness to this type of kind of intervention? So are there cognitive levels, or I guess attention abilities, or, what is the criteria for an individual who would benefit from this, I guess? Age, ability?
The research is mostly on preschool to school age kids. And so I would keep that in mind. I don't think there's any particular cognitive profile or like attention profile, anything like that, that is specific to ASI. Do you know of any, Susan?
No, I think it's like many OT practices focused very much on the individual and centering that piece. So taking it sort of individual by individual basis and evaluating in the assessment process whether that might be appropriate for them or not.
That actually did bring up some questions about the assessment. One of the comments was the SIPT requires a high level of cognition and understanding of verbal information that many students with autism may not have. So are there other options for assessing in order to determine if ASI might be a good fit? And then a question immediately following that is, what if the student's not able to complete all 17 of the standardized responses?
Yeah. So right now, the SIPT is the form of assessment that is talked about by the certification group. And so, yeah, I don't have a great response to that. If you participate in the training, they might have more guidance on what can and cannot be done. And I would imagine it's like most assessments where if there are certain, because there are 17 tasks, if there's a specific task that does not seem relevant to the student, that you could, make adjustments. But again, that would be something that you would have to go through the training to fully understand. And sort of one of the difficulties of implementing ASI is that it's such a specific training and assessment process right now that it's not always universally accessible at this point.
Right, and we should disclose that we are not in fact ASI trained therapists, and there are not very many of them out there, probably more where y'all are in California, but it is a pretty niche practice and would not necessarily be expected of your average OT.
Correct.
Would you repeat again, because I think now that everybody's absorbed your great information about, our IEP teams, really our job is to determine educational benefit, and if they aren't deriving educational benefit, to come up with the supports and services required to help them do that. So could you go over again, I guess, the research for this intervention that you talked about? It wasn't researched in schools. Someone said, should we start hiring and advertising for an OT that has this specialization? And what if we don't have somebody like that? And can we do it in the school? Should we spend a whole bunch of money and create a specialized room? Someone said a sensory room, but it's our understanding that the equipment isn't just like what people typically put in a sensory room. It's highly specific and quite expensive. So I guess if you could those were a lot of the questions, right, Patty, that kind of came up, some really concrete. I think there were a couple of people and they're going, oh no, we're going to start getting, referrals. I want, ASI assessment and intervention for my child as part of their IEP. So if you could kind of address, I think I captured it a little bit as a broad umbrella, with 3,000 specific points for you to answer. Good.
I'll start.
Sorry.
No, it is. We saw there were like 99 chats plus, so we probably should have left plenty of time for questions. But to review quickly, so this practice met our systematic review criteria because there were 3 group design articles. That's right. 3. A lot of our foundational practices have like close to hundreds of like modeling, reinforcement, prompting. Those foundational practices, visual supports have many, many, many articles supporting them. So this is a very new practice in the sense that it just barely met our criteria for inclusion as an evidence-based practice. That said, you know, you set criteria for what is going to meet cutoff and what's not, and we go with it. So this is very new, and it is based on 3 group design articles, and they all took place. I have my notes about them because I reread the articles this morning right next to me. They were only in clinic settings. They were 2 to 3 times a week, 45-minute sessions over usually 6 weeks or so within a clinic setting. So none of them took place in a school setting. None of them were implemented by school providers. And none of them talked about like successfully generalizing from that setting to home or school. So we're kind of blazing a new trail here, even suggesting options and introducing this topic, but no, I would not say generally that this is something that you should be ready to launch in schools or feel any pressure to do so.
Yeah, and I would just add, again, this is not the only practice that can address sensory needs. And sensory needs can be an ambiguous sort of term or concept for some people. But again, I pulled up the matrix, so I have the matrix in front of me now of our results from our systematic review. And, you know, we have, like I said, we talked about sensory outcomes falling under the motor domain. So if you want to look up any of our articles that have shown success in the motor domain, I'm looking at video modeling has had success, prompting and reinforcement, naturalistic interventions, regular modeling, exercise, like I stated. And so motor is a large category, and not all of those articles are specifically talking about sensory, but it's something to consider. And then really being reflective again about like, what's the goal and behavior here? Because some things can just be lumped into sensory broadly, thinking about what is this outcome? Is it an adaptive skill that I'm specifically seeing an issue with? Is it an interfering behavior that we're struggling with? And we do have other practices that work for those things. So, you know, it's very tricky, I think, and there's still a lot of misconception out there. So I recommend, if you have these concerns, talking to your OT. It might not be a sensory issue. It might be something else. So really taking thoughtful time to collaborate as a team and reflect and take some data and really see, is this actually what's happening here? And is this the appropriate intervention?
Well, I think that's a good place to end, although I know this group has a gajillion more questions. So we may, as time goes on, have you back and kind of do a follow-up, perhaps with a Q&A as we start to live the dissemination of this newest EBP. And they'll have tales from the experiences that they're going to have going forward. But Sally and Susan, we can't thank you enough. I mean, what an honor to have actually the developers of the Affirm module, and you did all that research, and it's amazing. So it's from the horse's mouth, as they say. So I want all our captain folks to give a big thank you and clap or put your little reactions on there. Thank you very much. This isn't the end, it's just the beginning of a conversation that we'll want to have again with you. Everybody's saying thank you in the chat. Thank you,
for having
everybody.
us.
Have a great day.
Thanks for having us.
There.